As we're getting started.
To Black women writers like Tony.
There's someone's microphone who's on. If you could please make sure your microphones are off. Thank you so much.
Hot mic.
Yeah, just double check. Thank you. Your microphone, it should say mute. It's in the bottom left corner of your screen. Thanks, we really, really appreciate it. So unless you're a panelist, your camera should be off also. We just ask that you do that so it's not distracting during this panel conversation. So thank you so much for understanding. So this is a Zoom call. As you know, you're all here. It's being recorded. So that's another reason why we ask you to just keep your cameras off for this conversation. So thank you so much for doing that. There's two different ways to watch a Zoom meeting. You can either watch it in speaker view or in gallery view. The top right corner of your Zoom screen should have those options. You can click on it to go back and forth between speaker view and gallery view. I really recommend watching it in speaker view. That way your screen is really focused on the person who's talking, which should be a panelist. Otherwise you're seeing lots of boxes, and I feel like that's not as effective a way to watch a panel conversation. Obviously up to you. If your camera's on, please turn it off. I will encourage you to do that. Thank you. So again, welcome. My name is Sari. I'm the Public Programs Director at MOFAD. If this is your first time coming to a MOFAD program, welcome. It's wonderful to have you. As I think most of you are aware, we have pivoted our programs online due to the COVID pandemic. Normally we're a physical museum, but because our doors are closed, this is where we're at. And this is great because it still allows us to have really wonderful conversations and connect with people all over the world, connect with people who, don't live in New York, so we wouldn't normally have the chance to be in conversation with. So, we're really looking at the silver lining of the situation, and we're really excited for the opportunity to keep having programs, keep having really interesting conversations about food, and keep connecting with you, our community. So we are so grateful that you're joining us this evening. There is going to be a Q&A at the end of this panel conversation. So if you would just for now hold your questions, just jot them down. There's a little chat button at the bottom of your screen. You can see that little chat icon. That's how we're going to do our Q&A at the end. You can just type your questions there. So I'll come back at the end of the panel and say, hey guys, it's Q&A time. And that's when you can start writing your questions in for our panelists. So just quickly, again, this is a program with the Museum of Food and Drink, MOFAD in New York. If you're not subscribed to our newsletter, I really encourage you to do that because we have lots of online programs all the time. Tomorrow, we have the second part of our Indigenous Roots program, which is a cooking demo with all of these wonderful people again. So before we start, I'm going to pass it over to my friend, Jennifer Brandt from 8th Nation, who helped curate this conversation. She's going to say a quick hello.
Hello, everyone, and thanks again to all the panelists, Yusuf, Elena, and David, and then Andi as well for hosting this. I'm just so excited that everyone was able to switch from our original plan, which was to do an in-person event, which obviously is, would be desirable, but of course we can't right now. So this is amazing that we can just come together and do this in a different way. The best part, like Sari said, was that, we're all kind of far apart. So originally we were going to bring everyone to New York, and now we don't have to, and you can see their amazing homes and their cool farms tomorrow. This is a passion project for me as an Indigenous person. This was something I brought to MOFAD last year, and it just happened to fit in with their programming. So it just kind of, things came together really well, and I'm so excited to now just kick off this panel and hear what everyone has to say.
Great. So we're going to have, thank you, Jen. And thank you for all of your hard work. We're going to have the panelists all introduce themselves. So why don't we start with Yusuf?
Hey, good evening, everyone. First of all, I'd like to say thanks for having me here. I'm very honored and humbled for this opportunity. My name is Yusuf Benrilla. I'm from Madison, Wisconsin. I'm a chef with Trade Roots, Afro Culinary Collective, and yeah, I'm happy to be here. So,
great, Elena, your microphone is muted. Just so you know, to unmute it.
All right. So, hello everyone. My name is Elena Terry. I'm a member of the Ho-Chunk Nation here in Wisconsin. I am the executive chef and founder of Wild Berries Culinary nonprofit. It's a community educational outreach company. And I am also the food and culinary program coordinator for the Native American Food Sovereignty Alliance. And I have partnerships with the University of Wisconsin-Madison, several tribal farms, and also the Intertribal Agriculture Council advocating for seed to kitchen and growing and farmers. So,
Thanks. Right, Dave.
Hey there, everybody. Thanks for having me. I'm Dave Smoke McCluskey. I'm a Mohawk chef, originally from New York. Now I'm down here in South Carolina, which gives me a little bit of insight as to what's going on, what we're talking about tonight. I've been a chef for about 35 years. Indigenous food, obviously, as I've traveled quite a bit, and I'm here in the South, pretty well versed in Southern cuisine and how African Americans have and as well as Indigenous folks have influenced that cooking.
Thank you. All right, and then last will be Andi, who is moderating tonight. So Andi, if you wouldn't mind just introducing yourself and then kick it off.
Yeah, thank you. So my name is Andi Murphy. I am the creator, the host, and the producer of the Toasted Sister podcast, which is a podcast all about Indigenous food. So, the last 3.5 years, I've been talking to, literally dozens of Native chefs and farmers and people who are working in this Native food movement. So if you want to know more about Indigenous food, there's 67 episodes in the archive. You can find those at toastedsisterpodcast.com or really anywhere you listen to podcasts. So I'm also a producer with Native America Calling radio program, which is a show all about Indigenous issues and topics. And that also is a really good resource for learning a lot more about Native people and issues. And we produce shows, Monday through Friday, every single week, 250 plus episodes a year. So that's a huge resource of Indigenous knowledge right there. If you're ever curious about that, again, that's Native America Calling, and that's nativeamericacalling.com. And I'm honored to be asked to moderate this discussion here, exploring and celebrating the intersections of Indigenous American and African American food. As we know, Native people have experienced a lot of atrocious events because of, European settlement and colonization here, and, conflicts with tribes turned into wars, into government-sanctioned removal and termination of tribes. And while this was all happening, African people were being kidnapped from Africa and forced into slavery here. And caught up in the middle is food, both of our food. And we know that food is not just food, it's a part of culture and it's a part of identity for both of us, Native Americans and African Americans. And because of that history, we see a cool blending of flavors and cultures which make up American food today, American food identity today. And I'll let the speakers on this panel get into what that looks like on a plate, but I'd like to go to David first to get a little bit of history and a little bit of background in all of this. So David, can you start with the meeting of African Americans and Native Americans here?
A lot of folks think that, we just recently celebrated Juneteenth here in America, which a lot of folks commemorate as some of the first enslaved Africans arriving here on the continent, which isn't quite exactly the truth. And it's an interesting date when it actually did happen. That was in 1526, when the Spaniards brought some enslaved Africans here to have a settlement on the coast of Georgia and South Carolina. It was a failed settlement. A part of that was part of a rebellion, is why it failed. The African enslaved folks rebelled and escaped, and when the Spaniards came back many years later or some years later to check on things, they were nowhere to be found. It would be my assumption that everyone kind of melted into the scenery and lived off the land and were accepted in by the local culture. So You know, those are some dates for that. But I mean, that was, you know, 80 years before Jamestown. That was 100 years before the Mayflower. So you know, folks have, as you honestly look at history, we kind of stay Anglo-centric to history. So it's usually what the English were up to, and not necessarily what the Spanish or the Portuguese were up to. So the enslaved folks that were in Virginia in 1619 were actually stolen from the Portuguese by privateers, and then they were traded for food to the colonists there in Virginia. So not as pointedly brought here as a lot of folks were from West Africa, mainly because of their knowledge. They've got about 3,000 years of rice cultivation. So a nice agrarian society, you know, strong knowledge going on there. A lot of those folks were brought here into Georgia, South Carolina, parts of Florida because of that knowledge, and they were used for farming, practices. So kind of a pointed thing there. A lot of them came through Charleston, South Carolina, in the Low Country. So what I like to say is that was kind of the start of the Low Country cooking, as African American cooks cooked most of the food there on the plantations for the owners as well as their fellow enslaved people. You know, obviously much different food on both tables, but there's a big influence there with people cooking what they know how to cook, and then they're also finding ingredients from here that are similar to what they have at home. And sometimes I use the explanation of corn. Corn is a porridge. Now that's a familiar item to any culture around the world because everybody has some type of grain porridge. So that could be rice, it could be any of the other super grains or things like that. So you've got this that's kind of familiar and adaptable to folks here. And I think African American culture embraced corn because it was also one of the things that was easy to grow here, but it was something that the bosses, if you will, it was cheap to them to grow and feed the folks. It didn't necessarily provide all the calories that they needed to survive. So a lot of the time, enslaved folks were left to fend for themselves, looking for protein and whatnot. So you've got fish and shellfish and meat that they're hunting their own game and whatnot as well. So again, that's native things that are coming into play there that more than likely some indigenous groups it showed folks what could be eaten and what couldn't be eaten. So and that was kind of embraced as well. And as I think they get more established, more seeds start to come across with them on the ships, and they're planting things like okra and benny seeds and things like that are pretty traditional here in South Carolina. So you have a little of that intermingling. And I like to say Low Country cuisine is very affected by Black folks, but there's a lot of stuff in there that's indigenous. Creole cuisine is another one. You know, obviously that's a melting pot there, but you know, there's some native stuff there as well. Not quite as much as say with the Low Country, but soul food's another prime example of there's things in soul food that wouldn't exist if it weren't for indigenous. I also like to point out that Africans are part of the gumbo pot too of Louisiana because they've brought okra into that pot. Natives are credited with tomatoes and filet, which is filet gumbo, which is the leaf from the sassafras tree. And that used to be used to thicken that stew or broth. So there's a lot of things like that on the coast with shrimp and oysters and things like that that are familiar to all of these cultures. More so, I think, to the African and the indigenous community than, say, to the Europeans that generally didn't eat a lot of that stuff then. Historically, you have the two peoples intermingling as far as those basics of ingredients go. You have things that have gone back to Africa with say the Spaniards from Central America, potatoes and peanuts and things like that eventually do come back into the South via Africa. So it wasn't part of our foodways here in the Southeast, but it's part of indigenous foodways, if you will. So people claim things left and right, and we here in America tend to give Africans a claim to peanuts, but they're from Central America. most of our common beans that are eaten. So I'm pointing these two out because they're popular in the African American community. Are red beans. For red beans and rice, that's a classic combination of something that's indigenous and African. The red beans are an indigenous food. They're a common bean. Just about all of the common beans of the world are from here in the Americas. So that's kind of a glaring thing for me. We also say butter beans here in the South, or limas, as most of you up north will know them as. But lima is Lima, Peru. So they're actually a Peruvian product that were brought in later. I think it was the mid to late 1800s where those kind of started to come in. People like these nice fat beans and whatnot. So there's a lot of things in there that are indigenous, but they might not be specifically indigenous to the Southeast. But as a lot of folks insist on identifying us by race, I claim things from South and Central America as well, and it's ours. So corn came from Central America and migrated north and south like wildfire over I think it's almost 10,000 years that we've been growing corn since its first domestication. So a lot of farming going on between the two cultures that I think gets lost in translation a lot of the time.
Yeah. Yeah, and what about what was going on, like what kinds of things were going on with indigenous people being affected by colonization around this time? We're talking like the 1700s and the 1800s, and Yusuf and Elena, you could go ahead and jump in on this one too, but this is also a question for Dave. Like what was native food, what were the conflicts that indigenous people were up against at that time? We were talking 1700s, 1800s.
A lot of the conflict was intertribal, if you will, pre-colonization or a little bit of colonization. So what happened in a lot of America was European folks used other tribes to kind of fight with each other. So a lot of warring. Here in the Southeast, it was a meeting of 5 language groups, if you will. So lots of conflict there, but still almost very Three Sisters dish. So corned beef and squash, but the beans came in a little bit later. So a lot of corn and squash were used. And as the beans come in, you're adding that third sister, but you're looking at that as a little bit of the things that were grown, sunflowers and things like that. But nuts were very important. Pecan nuts, hickory nuts, all of those nuts. I like to call those the alternate protein source for indigenous folks, because there wasn't always game around, or there wasn't always fish. So these nuts became very important to folks. So we ate a lot of things that they were roasted, or they were ground and pounded, or they were made into nut butters. Kind of a misnomer that peanut butter is that much of a reach, like that was invented in the 1800s. I have a feeling it probably wasn't, because there's a tradition of making nut butters here in the Americas, not necessarily to spread on bread.
And there's also
that and made it famous. George Washington. That's an interesting point that you make, Dave. Because like a nut butter, it's basically a chewed up, like anybody that chewed up a nut ever made nut butter in their mouth. Like that was the first person who did it. But no, I think like the influence that went both ways with indigenous food and African American, like during historically, I think like a lot of the things that we find today, I always use cornbread as an example because people think that that's, traditional soul food, but, it starts with corn. So, but then also flavor, like, I think like the drive to create food, but then also food that was delicious with meager means and meager resources was something that indigenous and African people had to contend with because of colonialization and slavery. And we were constantly, scraping by, essentially. I think, used to doing that anyway. It's you know, kind of a little bit of forage, a little bit of living off the land, and a little bit of what you've grown. So, you know, we've as Indigenous folks, it's my belief that we've lost a lot of flavorings to things. So, when you start adding that forage into a lot of our food, it's when you start to develop more flavors. The African folks never really lost that forage stuff because they had to forage it while they were here, because they just weren't fed very well by their owners, you know, they were fed as little as they could be fed, and they were told to fend for themselves for the rest of it. So that forage is in part of that. So I think our groups came together as you're foraging, or somebody's teaching folks what's edible and what's not, because it can't be all trial and error and then boom, it's a foodway, you know. So I think there was a lot more sharing there than probably the Anglo folks wanted to admit or bothered to even categorize historically. It just wasn't important to them.
Yeah, or to take notice even.
Right.
Yeah. Elena?
Yeah, I think that it's important to recognize that there was a lot of displacement during that time, you know, and in order to even just maintain yourself and to be able to protect your family, those relationships had to be built. There wasn't a lot of time for settling and being able to, you know, cultivate crops, but you were able to rely on a lot of bartering, even if that bartering was knowledge sharing or resource sharing and showing where you could find water and stuff. I think that it's very critical to say and to recognize that we have those ancestral ingredients today because those partnerships were maintained way back when. You know, there have been seeds returned to tribes that have been saved and stewarded over centuries in places like the Kentucky Hills.
What's your question?
Hey, Dad, why don't we share it?
And so I think that it's important that we kind of acknowledge that the partnership and the intertwining has been what kept us and brought us to where we are now, even in being able to continue to grow those ingredients like the beans and the corn that had sustained us through those times. You know, the relationship was crucial for continuity.
Right.
And the sanctity of carrying and saving the seeds are something that I think both cultures really identified with, because obviously we wouldn't have these things today if they weren't carried and planted by people all the time and throughout history. So I think that was another connection that we had early on, and just, you know, the need to survive forced us to interact a lot more.
Right. And Elena, can you give a little bit more background about how Native food has been affected by colonialism, and what does that lead to today? Sort of give us like that landscape sort of picture.
Absolutely. I mean, it was drastically affected by colonialism and what was introduced into the diets, and how it has affected us even, you know, centuries later, consuming some of the things like processed foods as opposed to the wild and the foraged foods, or, you know, the clean hunted foods. It's affected everything from our being, but it has also brought about this wonderful time of, you know, revolutionary awareness and our food systems, and this need to connect now, and kind of coming full circle and acknowledging that, you know, at one time it was discouraged to go to the woods and find your food. It was a status thing that you weren't able to go to the grocery store and purchase food like other people. And it was discouraged to continue on with that knowledge. But luckily, you know, there were people who are aware of the significance of it, and over time, you know, have been able to maintain those seeds. Like I think it's amazing to know that I have access to squash that Ho-Chunks ate, you know, 400 years ago, or pure ancestral Ho-Chunk corn, and that's just Ho-Chunk. We have access to so many other tribes who valued it so much as a source of not just nourishment, but connection to each other, you know, connection to our history, and providing for our future, that it is valued as much as it is. And we're lucky that we were able to share that, and also help you know, a whole other culture that leaned on us, that were also oppressed and also being affected by, you know, having their culture removed. And we were able to also nourish them, and they were able to share with us as well. So I think that it's important that colonialism affected not only Indigenous people, but also the African Americans that were brought here. And I think that that relationship that was developed is very sacred. And without, you know, those traditional roots that we were able to have in supporting each other as people of color, and, you know, kind of being on the attack during those hundreds of years, actually, that we were able to continue now and be able to celebrate not the struggles or the trauma, but the resilience and the strength that came from, you know, being able to share this nourishing food and these ancestral ties with each other. It just made us that much stronger.
Yeah, thank you. And I'd like to add, you know, Elena's talking about, you know, culture being removed from Native Americans, and that was done in a couple of different ways throughout history. That was done in, you know, Indian Wars, separating people from indigenous food and their important food resources as war tactics. And then, you know, after that came the reservation systems, where people, indigenous people, could not leave the reservations, as these were like prisons. So you're cutting off, you know, people's ability to gather and grow food and follow the food as they always used to, and putting them into, you know, reservations. And then after that came boarding schools, you know, a whole generations of our Native children being put into boarding schools, where they are, you know, forced to learn, you know, American ways and forget their indigenous ways, which included indigenous food. So, you know, it's amazing how Native food has survived all of that, and we kept these things secret, and we kept them, you know, sacred, and protected them into what we see now. And that leads into like the really cool work that you're doing, Elena, and you're partnering with Yusuf. And I'd like for you guys to talk a little bit more about your work. Yusuf, talk about trade routes. Where did that come from, and how did it turn into, what is the group you and Elena came up together? Wild Roots.
Wild Roots.
Yeah, go ahead.
Trade Routes started originally as it started like we had brought Michael Twitty to Madison to do a talk, and then he talked to the people that came together to do a little pop-up, Devin Hamilton and Candy Flowers. He talked to us and the importance of traveling back to Africa. So we started Trade Routes as a way to raise money to go to Africa with Michael Twitty and Roots to Glory's tours, on a genealogical quest to discover our roots, essentially. So that's how Trade Routes started. And, you know, we did pop-up dinners at Badger Rock Neighborhood Center, selling food for $10 a plate to earn them the funds. And then we built up, you know, a local following, and eventually we went to Africa. So Elena and I have been working together for a while, I would say like 3 or 4 years, and we kind of started, you know, pretty immediately, like mashing up, you know, our food styles. I've learned a ton of indigenous foodways from Elena, and so then, you know, together we kind of started Wild Roots, which is a mashup of wild berries and trade roots.
Yeah, and it's really been about honoring the seed to kitchen cookery and the growers that help supply us with these amazing ingredients, and the foragers and the hunters, and really being able to highlight those flavors in a way that is relatable to both of our cultures, and that honors, like I said, I don't like to say trauma or struggle, but it really honors the resiliency of not only the people, but of the ingredients. Like you said, during the Great Moves, you know, we sowed seeds into our clothes to hide them so that they wouldn't be taken away and they'd be protected. And those kinds of acts of resiliency were also exemplified by the African Americans during that time, and being able to honor not only those ingredients, but also those relationships and those triumphs through culture by sharing a meal with somebody and providing that kind of experience, like sensical memories. I think that is what food is all about. Even just being a chef, being able to represent those ingredients in a way that you can honor relationships and historical activities. And it's just a beautiful thing to be able to do. So in the last Seed to Kitchen meal that Yusuf and I did together, we did a white corn mush with a candied squash and some gumbo. And we were able to also utilize our partnership with the UW growers and the horticulture and use their okra in these amazing strains that we have been able to have access to. So it's also that these wonderful ingredients are coming back to us and we're able to get them out there and be noticed. And if we can represent them in a way that they're really appreciated and our story is appreciated, they are going to have a better chance for sustainability. And people are going to say, oh, I want to grow that one okra that Yusuf and Elena cooked that one time. And, you know, it just gives them a stronger chance for, you know, sustainability and continuity for the future. So it's a wonderful thing. I love doing Wild Roots events and working with Yusuf. So.
Right. Yeah. And Yusuf, I'd like to go back to you too. I mean, Africa, you went to Africa and, you know, really kind of explored your own identity there. How did that actually come about?
Going to Africa came about, it wasn't like, you know, like I've always kind of wanted to go, but I was really, you know, I had been working with indigenous food groups for a while, and with Dan Cornelius, Intertribal Agricultural Council, the Mobile Farmers Market, Native Food Network. Elena and I have traveled around extensively in the Midwest, working with different tribes, the Meskwaki, the Anishinaabe in Michigan. And, you know, like I was drawn initially just because the food is really delicious. I went to Standing Rock because, you know, honestly, because it was the right thing to do. But I met some really amazing chefs at Standing Rock, and we were, you know, committed to working together when we got back to, got back to our homes. So, I was initially drawn into by the variety of ingredients that I'd never worked with and how delicious everything was. But then witnessing indigenous folks rediscovering their lost foodways and reclaiming their foodways like really inspired me and got me thinking about my lost food traditions. And so, you know, going to Africa, you know, I saw instantly, it was just like, it wasn't like being in a foreign land. It was like, I really felt at home. And you could see, you know, like the level of agriculture and the way that people farm there. It's just like, that's why they stole us, because they could see that too. It's just like hardworking, beautiful, amazing, vast landscapes of farmland, all done by hand. I saw very little machinery in Africa, like tractors and stuff like that. It was just a bunch of Africans out there working. And so, you know, the familiarity was there, and it's really just, you know, galvanized. Elena talked about our work with Seed to Kitchen. Initially, I went to Seed to Kitchen as just a taster. And now I'm partnering with the University of Wisconsin. We have African diaspora gardens in Madison at Eagle Heights and some at West Madison Research Center. But we're growing foods from the diaspora: okra, beni, sorghum. We got sweet potatoes in there, tomatoes, because those are adopted foodways for us here and where we are today. So, you know, might as well celebrate that as well, and that mashup of culture there. But yeah, going to Africa and then coming back has just really galvanized my, you know, yearning for doing more interesting indigenous, Afro-Indigenous mashup foods. It's given me a deeper appreciation of the sanctity of seeds that Elena and Dave they really care about food. And it's not just like, it's a spiritual thing because it's a sustainer. It's a life force. It's a unifier. Like you can erode a lot of barriers with a good meal, so that's what, it's been a lifelong journey, I guess. And here I am now just embracing the fruit of all that struggle.
Right, right. And for consumers of food, people you guys are catering to, I know part of the mission is to just get that food out there and let people taste it for the first time, and also have, that little experience of reclamation with food that is their own, and just understanding of food that is not their own, is not in their tradition. But why is it important to celebrate this specific intersection today, the intersection of Indigenous American and African American food? Why don't we go with maybe Dave first?
I just think there's a lot of ingredients that have been used by both cultures that they're great things. Corn and rice are two huge parts of world agriculture. 64% of the world's crops are native to the Americas. So there's a lot of our ingredients that have, I sometimes say that our food and our foodways are probably an even bigger gift than democracy to the world. Once you realize there's corn, beans, squash, potatoes, tomatoes, peppers, beans, there's just been such a large gift of our food that's gone all over the world to help feed the world now for hundreds of years. It's an interesting connection. African folks here, African American folks here, have had a culture here now for almost 500 years, and they've got their own foodways here that incorporate our foods, and they're pretty tasty. So they're ingrained in American food, if you will, though we don't always acknowledge those things. So these are some of the things I talk about with Indigenous food, is that we're here all the time. We're on all of your tables, but you don't give us any credit for it a lot of the time. You forget that squash is ours, which means the zucchini or the summer squash that you have on the table. Not just the corn and the beans, but tomatoes are from here, green beans are from here. Yeah. All of those things. So it's important for me sometimes to point all of that stuff out. African folks have embraced some things that most African Americans, you wouldn't get them to even realize that some of this stuff was from here and not from Africa, because they're so ingrained in their society. I sometimes use sweet potato to point that out, because sweet potatoes were substituted for yams. Yams don't exist here in America, but they're grown extensively in Africa. So they're very similar vegetables. So African folks embraced the sweet potato because it was familiar to them. Similar taste, similar shape, similar ways to cook it. So it's almost like it's theirs now. People forget that sweet potatoes are from here. So sometimes I like to point a little bit of that out to some of my African American friends that are chefs. But it's neat to know some of these things. My elders taught me to know these things. So know about our ingredients, keep reminding people that they're ours. It keeps some of our ways alive. But you have to remember that erasing foodways is part of how you perpetrate genocide. So we can use the euphemisms of removal and hunting people, but it was genocide and ethnic cleansing. We can call it the Trail of Tears, but Trail of Tears is just a euphemism for ethnically cleansing groups of people from an area, which would be here in the South, that aren't such nice things, and they're not nice, quaint pieces of history. So like Elena says, we're sowing seeds into our clothing to be able to take them somewhere where we don't know the landscape. If you get removed from, say, the mountains of Tennessee to Oklahoma, forget about foraging if they let you off the reservation, because you don't know what to eat there. I mean, you might recognize a few things, but you've lost a whole portion of your diet, which would be wild foods, by getting dragged there, if you. And so we've got a tremendous amount of loss with our stuff, or a disconnect where sometimes the African American community has kept foraging things. You find things like people mentioning poke salads and things like that. So ditch greens is some folks like to say. I like to say, you eat the weeds. So I eat the weeds out of my lawn all winter long because I haven't sprayed here in almost 20 years. And want them, so, you're out getting tender greens out of the lawn in the wintertime or out of the ditch. Those are things that we shouldn't forget. As much as we don't forget about seeds, we shouldn't forget about our wild foods as well.
Right. Okay.
I think both of our cultures being tribal, as well as earth-based religions in the beginning, I think we recognized that in each other, and we were able to get along fairly well because of those similarities with not just our food, but our cultures as a whole.
Right, thanks. And you guys, Yusuf and Elena, why is it important today to, recognize these intersections and celebrate it?
You go first, Elena.
Okay. Well, I think it's important, especially right now today, given the situation that we're in, really being a chef of Indigenous foods is very spiritual. It connects you in a lot of ways, and being able to not only grow, but cook and share those ingredients, it's a different level of having a meal with each other. And you really do look at that nourishment as affecting more than just your body, but it reminds you of the things that our ancestors have endured, and that nourishment was able to give them what they needed to make it through times harder than this. We did just come out of, well, we're not out of it, but we are in the process of a lot of change right now, and really going back to your roots and being able to make those connections through food. I think it's a beautiful thing to be able to share with each other, and being able to, really trigger the blood memories that you have in the flavors and the experiences. And the first time I ate this ingredient, like, those are the things that keep you grounded in times of uncertainty. So I think it's really crucial right now that we do rely on the basics, the wild foods, our ancestral ingredients, and really kind of simplify some of the things that naturally nourish our bodies, and not just our bodies, but our spirits also. So, I'm really blessed to be on this journey and to be able to have access to these ingredients and cook styles and even flavor combinations, and to be able to find the wild foods, like Dave said, in different regions. They're so different. Even the same ingredient can be completely different based on the region. Right. And I think that you can honor that, and you can really appreciate the natural flavors of those things and make those connections with each other in a time when there is so much isolation from each other. So yes, thank you again for including me in the Indigenous Roots journey. And like I said, it's something that we just naturally do, and I'm grateful that people appreciate the flavors and the intention and the mindfulness behind the cookery of those ingredients. So thank you. Yusuf?
Thank you, Elena. I think, like, now it's more crucial than ever. This is a Black Lives Matter moment, and it's really galvanized people. With COVID, people saw firsthand how fast, food insecurity, even if you think like, you're immune from that, but you see how fast that spread. I've seen more, like, folks, all walks of life, interested in gardening, urban farming, just resilience gardening, to make sure that they can access food when they need it and the grocery store shelves are empty. And as it's like interesting that, like, really diving into Indigenous foods because it was delicious and, like, good people, I was able to find my food ways as an African, and because I was willing to open myself up to new experiences with other cultures. And I think that that's what this is all about, and hopefully that's a message that people get out of this, is that we're stronger together than we are separated. And a lot of the barriers that used to separate us, you know, it's only a mental thing now. So, you know, you could tear down some of those walls by reaching out and just diving in. You might find some uncomfortable moments, but it's educational moments too. So, you know, like Dave and Elena and a lot of Indigenous people that I've worked with embrace the Black Lives Matter movement, which is important to me because, you know, we're in a struggle together. So, you know, like Standing Rock, like, you know, the activism that going around all around the nation, it's a powerful tool potentially to galvanize us as a nation, as a people.
Right, right, and food is a really good way to do that. Learning about other people's food cultures, those histories there, those collaborations. Yeah, and I think we're open for questions now. Start the Q&A.
Yeah, hi everyone. Wow, thank you so much, panelists. This has been such a beautiful conversation. We want to open it up to all of you to ask any questions you might have for the panel. So your chat is open. Please just make sure you're typing your questions to everyone so everyone can see the questions, and we'll facilitate that because we have a couple more minutes. I was just wondering, Yusuf, I mean, to your point about the awareness about Indigenous groups and other people of color at this time because of the Black Lives Matter movements that are happening, do you see other efforts? Like, obviously there's your work that you're doing with Elena, but do you see other similar types of organizations taking off, or do you see more attention being focused on both African American and Indigenous food organizations because of like where we're at in the current political moment?
Absolutely. It's like undeniable the interest that's, you know, sprang forward from this climate that we're in, the time that we're in. A year ago when, you know, my teammates Christian Keeves and Rue Gengar, we were talking about starting the Diaspora Garden Project. You didn't hear people talking about diaspora gardens. Now it's on everyone's tongue, like diaspora gardens. It's like a thing now. But it's like, I think like awareness is being raised. I think like the younger generation now is more accepting and more educated to looking at agriculture as not a form of slavery. So that's something that young Black kids want to get into now when they see, you know, people of color, people look like them out there, you know, farming and then cooking that food, and it's delicious. And a lot of kids have that in their curriculum that we work with now. So it's becoming part of, you know, who they are as beings. Whereas when I was growing up, I looked at farming as kind of like a form of slavery in a weird way. And like, why would I want to do that? But it was just because the way that I was conditioned at the time. So I think like, you know, this is like, you know, it's a beautiful time, but it's also a delicious time to embrace.
Right. Yeah. And it looks like we have a couple of questions kind of on the same thread as that. Catherine is asking, how do you see youth growing this movement? How does intersectional environmentalism connect with Indigenous and Black foodways? Somebody want to tackle that first?
I'll go for it. You know, Badger Rock's a prime example. So Badger Rock Neighborhood Center, they have like it's a 6th through 8th grade school. And so they have a 3-year cycle where it's food, land, and water. And so like, you know, each year those are the focus. They have a huge community garden, but they also have part of their curriculum where every day kids are working with in the greenhouse. They're preparing meals from the greenhouse. So they grow up with that and it's instilled in them. So, and these young food warriors are, you know, they're way more educated than I was at that age, you know, and that's hands down. So it's, we've got a really strong generation of people coming up with food pride and knowledge of seed saving. Elena and Dave can attest to that too in the Indigenous food circles.
Great. There's a question about whether or not Africans brought over seeds when they were brought over from Africa to America. I know, Elena, you touched on that for Indigenous people. Do you want to speak on that anymore? Because I know there's always a lot of kind of conjecture about what seeds possibly came over from Africa when enslaved Africans were forced to come to the United States.
Well, I mean, I think it's important to recognize that those struggles were universal. You know, I mean, when you're taken from your homeland, you need to know how you're going to provide. And although I don't know, you know, specific examples, there are stories of how those seeds were preserved and brought over. And the fact that we do have okra here in the way that Yusuf is able to grow it in his diaspora garden, you know, exemplifies that there were extreme measures taken to bring those seeds over here, and they were protected and not only brought here, but then also with intention to cultivate them. You know, that you would have to stay in one place or grow them in a protected area to be able to have them for a whole season, you know, be fruitful. So I think that it's important to say that, yes, those things were done, those extreme measures were held, because there is that great value that prior to, you know, the convenience of grocery stores, we had towards our food systems and honoring what that food meant to us, not only, you know, for nutrients, but for so much more. And it was a connection to home for them during those moves.
Also, so one way that we know that people brought seeds on the slave ships was in their hair. They would tie benny seeds, rice, okra, any seed that you could put in, you know, in your hair, and they would carry seeds across that way.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Well, I want to let everyone know too that I put in the chat the Resilient Cities Badger website, the link to that as well. So if folks are interested about that, there's a link to that.
Thanks, Jen.
Here's if we have time for this question, it's kind of a big one, but I like this one. How can the restaurant industry become more inclusive of Black, Indigenous, people of color, chefs and owners? I know that's one question I get a lot as a Toasted Sister is, well, where are the Native restaurants? You know?
Yeah, where are they? I think they're generally clustered towards where there's reserves. A lot of the time, you find some in some cities, but you know, I don't think people always think of our food as something that they're going to go out for right now. I think some of our food's still alien to a lot of people, though. You know, as I said, a lot of our foods are already part of their diets. So many different cultures throughout the U.S. as well. It's you know, we don't have one defined foodway, if you will. I mean, we're all very similar, but we don't have one specific cuisine. Like you can go up there to Minneapolis and find something completely different than you'd find down here in the Southeast or in the Northeast for that, or out West.
I can speak to that a little bit, actually. Yeah. There is a group called I Collective that I'm sure that you're aware of that isn't necessarily Native restaurants, but it is a group of chefs and seed savers, etc. It's a collective of folks, and that's, I think, one way that people are trying to kind of grow that, and at least have Native chefs. And it's, you know, it's not necessarily a restaurant, but they might do a pop-up or certain events around that. And thank you, sorry for putting that in there as well.
Yeah, and I think another thing that needs to be addressed with this is the sustainability of our ingredients. You know, if you are going to have one menu item as a staple, we did a takeover here at the Ho-Chunk Casino in Wisconsin Dells, and to be able to get the amount of ingredients that we needed to sustain the line for 1 month was incredible. So another thing is that we do like to honor our ingredients and use them resourcefully and sparingly, and have people eat with intention and mindfulness, and to know where all of those ingredients come from. For me personally, you know, operating on a restaurant level capacity would take away some of the uniqueness of my ingredients. So I am able to provide a different kind of meal if I do that, you know, once a month for several hundred people, as opposed to daily for a certain amount of covers, if that makes any sense. Plus, for me personally, I need to be out in the woods foraging or, you know, processing game if I want access to those ingredients. I can't work at a restaurant every day, open to close, and make sure that I have the restaurant running when I have to put so much care into acquiring my ingredients. And that's just me personally.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's a lot of our ingredients that just aren't grown in volume. You know, they're enough to sustain a small store or an online store, but not enough to sustain usage in the restaurant business. So that, which is, you know, kind of leaves you going back to finding other sources, which is I've done throughout my 30 years in the business. And it's hard to find things, you know, that they're out there, but sometimes a lot of stuff just stays very local. And local folks can use them, and that doesn't necessarily mean there's a big city around where, you know, you're going to be able to sell some of that stuff too. So wild rice sells, corn sells, but some of the other things you don't necessarily find. You can find cranberry beans, but they're not our cranberry beans. They're usually ones that have disappeared and gone wild somewhere that somebody's crossbred, or aren't really what the originals are. So you find semblances of, you know, thereof, or you find Quaker oats corn being used for cornbread and things like that that just don't taste anything like what we're used to growing up with. So finding those things, or finding the farms, you know, finding the native farms that are big enough to grow that amount of stuff is complicated as well. You know, because we don't have a lot of our seeds, or we don't have enough of them to sustain that type of acres and acres and acres of growth that would take to feed 1,000 people a year. That same meal is a constant. So much like Elena said, there's just not enough. There's not enough space. I think there's room for farmers to grow, and then you kind of go from seed saver to farmer to, you know, smaller farmer to volume farmer, and that's a completely different animal there. And once you start growing hundreds of acres of corn, it's much different than growing a few acres.
And for those of you that ordered the corn kit, you're going to be able to taste some actual indigenous types of corn. And for those of you coming to the cooking demo tomorrow, we'll get a little bit more into cooking techniques, but there is a question that maybe some of you can speak to quickly. Are there any particular cooking techniques or preservation processes that are unique to indigenous or African cultures that you could speak to?
Barbecue. Barbacoa, as you would say. Both of us can kind of lay claim to that to some degree. Once you're removed out of the Southeast, you know, you're kind of out of that whole barbecue talk and that whole talk and flavor. So, but traditionally Native Americans here in the South, excuse me, would cook in that style over wood, kind of long and slow, either in a pit or suspended over a smoldering fire, if you will. So that barbacoa comes from Spanish, but it's a bastardization of I believe it's Arawak, which is one of the islands just off the coast. So
and it was
pretty prevalent here.
It was also mentioned the nixtamalization, and that is another thing significant actually when you talk about nutrition and sharing knowledge and being able to share the knowledge of the nixtamalization of the corn. You know, that knowledge wasn't brought back to Europe with the corn, and they weren't understanding why they weren't getting the nutrients, but that crucial piece of knowledge was not shared with them on how to nixtamalize the corn. So yes, definitely some of that information was necessary to be shared, and we didn't share all of that, and we did protect some of those ingredients because of you know, not sharing all of that knowledge during those times. But
well, you also have different histories too of how you process grains. So the Europeans like to kind of grind stuff in between two stones, a la wheat and some of those things. So I think maybe there's a bit of arrogance involved there too, as we can smash it between two stones. It's the same thing, and you kind of ignore that very important process of creating those nutrients and whatnot, naming niacin in that process of lying corn, which left the South with a bunch of pellagra here from the 1700s to the 1800s, till they kind of figured out what was causing that, and it was the lack of niacin in the corn, which I've studied this quite a bit, and it's kind of a bit of an epiphany here when you think that something that's been grown for 10,000 years, that knowledge has been there for that long. that knowledge had to have translated to somebody somewhere, because it's a crucial part of eating that corn. Otherwise, you're eating hollow calories that you can't get all the vitamins and minerals out of it. It might just as well be a starch at that point.
And you wouldn't have hominy grits without nixtamalization. So there was, again, there's that conversation that was had, and somebody listened and just didn't think that the indigenous people were sprinkling dirt or just putting ashes in their food. Like, oh, they put ashes in their food. It's delicious. So, but then that nixtamalization didn't follow to Africa necessarily. So, like hominy, so corn preparation, people got pellagra as well in Africa when corn became like a major grain, part of their diet. So what they found is fermentation. So they will make things like akasa, and that is fermented corn dough that through the fermentation process, the bacteria break down the corn so that the nutrients are more accessible to your gut. And so that, even though nixtamalization nixtamal didn't follow corn to Africa, people realized that there was something that they needed. So they'll, make a ball of corn dough, let it sit outside until it gets a little tangy, and then steam that or boil that. And then you eat that, and you use it like your spoon, as opposed to like a utensil. So
I've got black corn in my fridge right now, fermenting for soft cake. So still use it today to some degree. It's an interesting technique on getting things done. One of the things about nixtamalization that's cool is that in the absence of gluten, that process by adding the lye to that corn breaks down the pericarp, or the outer shell of the corn, and turns it to a gel. Some of it you can flake off and wash away, but some of that gel sticks. So with the absence of nixtamalization, you cannot have masa dough. You can't have corn chips. You can't have tamales. You can't have tortillas. You can't have any of that stuff. So that's all important stuff for people to recognize if they don't think of, well, I've never had anything that's been nixtamalized. Well, yeah, you have. Even Fritos are nixtamalized. So it's that gel that's possible with the changing of the pH of the water and the cooking that allows things to stick together. So it's gluten-free as well. I'm always amazed at just the combinations that the three sisters provide us as far as nourishing us. So
that's a great point, Dave.
Is really cool. Just because that gel doesn't exist without that process, and that's an indigenous process.
Great. That segues really nicely to this question that I think is important to ask to all of you. With some of the health disparities that exist among Black and Indigenous communities relative to the general population, can you all speak to the nutritional impacts or benefits that you see coming from us embracing more of our food traditions, excluding Fritos, I would say?
I can say something about that if I could.
Please.
I think that when you are more mindful with the ingredients that you're eating and the intention behind the meal, you first of all don't consume as much, and you are a little bit more honoring where those ingredients came from. Say if I have hand harvested wild rice, that this grandfather and his grandson harvested, and I know that they parched it the traditional way, I might not eat that, just in front of the TV. I might honor that and sit down and enjoy that meal. And it's also that those ingredients are coming without those additional preservatives or chemicals. It's pure, it's coming from that lake, and it was smoked and treated with such care that, you're going to enjoy that meal and the intention behind that meal and that nourishment differently than, mindlessly driving through McDonald's. So I think that when you start connecting to your roots and the source of your food, even if it's just knowing that something's organic or something is organic practiced or where it's grown, even that kind of knowledge makes you a little bit more appreciative of every single bite and those flavors that are offered. And so I think that it kind of stops your overconsumption and your mindless eating, and it also makes you a little bit more aware of the food systems and the sourcing of your ingredients also. So I think that it just makes you all around more aware, but it makes you enjoy your meals more as well. So I definitely advocate for it.
Yeah.
Yeah, just mentioned the three sisters. I sometimes describe myself as a bit of a three sisters evangelist, if you will. So when you look at those three ingredients, when they're eaten together, they provide you with the perfect food source that your body needs to live. You don't need anything else beyond those three things. That would get pretty boring, of course, but those three things provide you with all the vitamins and minerals and proteins that you need to survive as humans.
And just to clarify, that's corn, squash, and beans.
Corn, beans, and squash, correct. So, you know, even with the nixtamalization of the corn, which is almost always done, it enhances the protein percentage that'll come out of beans, which is, you know, something scientific. But so these things kind of combined, not only in the field as a polyculture. There's no other crops grown as a monoculture or polyculture that puts out the amount of energy produced for you to eat that's healthier than those three things. So I kind of evangelize about that a little bit, but all of those things can be easily made vegan, vegetarian, which I don't necessarily believe in. I don't think that natives were vegans or vegetarians or any of that stuff. I've started to view these three things as vehicles for our foraged ingredients. So you can't eat corn soup and even in all of its derivatives several days a week and not want to, you know, throw it out whoever cooked it. So I think, you know, as you start to add other ingredients to that, you know, hey, there's some wild onions as you're walking by, or there's some watercress, or we shot a squirrel, or there's been a wild hog killed. So all of these different things go into the pot at different times. So these three things that sustain us, which means our sustainers, they're enhanced by these things. So I think you can return to that diet happily and live a pretty healthy life. And it doesn't have to exclude the pork that I just spoke of that DeSoto brought here in 1540. Probably here before the Navajo sheep, which we celebrate, but we kind of denigrate pork for some reason. But pork, when it was brought here, wiped out a lot of our deer and turkey through disease, which a lot of us don't really realize or know. So yeah, we took to eating those things. We took to eating those things because pork's good. Pork's pretty damn good. Even the stuff that us poor folks got to eat when all the other cuts were saved for other folks are pretty good. Ribs that everyone
Yasmin writes in, and she's asking how so Black foodways often get a bad rap. Soul food, fried chicken, sweet potato pecan pie, grits, you know, collard greens with bacon and ham hocks. And when I went to Africa, I didn't see obesity. I saw, you know, the amount of, you know, everybody ate very healthy. Rice was part of every meal. There was always like, kind of like a little simple like Creole sauce served with every meal, the amount of seafood at every meal, but no one was hungry. Or like, you know, I didn't see starvation in the places where I was. There was bounty, it was on the coast, but it also, it made it more important to start growing some of these things like collards, celosia, and, you know, just fresh vegetables from the diaspora, from Africa here, so that I can have access to that. Right. And then don't have to be stuck with the food choices that are offered by what restaurants or businesses happen to be in my area.
I think a misnomer is that, I'm sorry.
No, go ahead.
I think a misnomer is that all soul food per se was pork fat heavy. I don't believe that. I think pork fat was part of things. I think it was in moderation. If you've ever cooked a ham hock, you realize that there's not a lot of fat there. There's a lot of flavor. That's if it's been smoked, there's not a ton of fat there. So there's not big slicks of butter on top of things. Generally, when you watch older soul food cooks cooking things, there's not a ton of cheese. There's not a ton of that stuff. So as the American diet has progressed, we eat a lot more of those things for whatever reason, because we're kings. We have lawns and we eat steak every night. There's a chicken on every table. I think that's a little bit of our American arrogance, if you will. We've forgotten that moderation is key to things. We used to have bacon every week, but we have it every few weeks now, and it's not that big of a deal. It was at first, but so everything in moderation. So I say drinking and things like that as well, but everything in moderation isn't such a bad thing if you're mindful of what you're eating.
Traditionally, people would maybe, if they were lucky, they would have. If they were lucky, they would have fried chicken once a week on a Sunday.
Right.
Which isn't a bad thing. My grandmother lived to be 98 years old and she ate fried chicken once a week. So it might be a cure for some things. But
okay.
Okay, guys, I'm going to jump in because I think we're getting a little bit off topic here. And we are going to continue the conversation about food tomorrow. For those of you who are joining us at the cooking demo, we went a little bit over tonight, which is great. We had so many good questions. I'm so sorry we didn't get to them all, but I will follow up with an email so everyone can follow all the chefs and Andi on social. You can ask your questions, and you can email us at MOFAD and hold your questions for tomorrow if we didn't get to them, and hopefully we will then. So thank you so much. Thank you so much to all of our panelists.
Thanks.
Yeah, thank you guys. And
thank you guys so much.
See you tomorrow for those of you that are joining us. Good night. Thank
Good night.
you.
Good night.